The moment I knew my family had already decided my fate happened at my own wedding rehearsal. I was standing in the empty reception hall, holding a clipboard, listening to my mother argue with the event coordinator about table arrangements that no longer mattered. My fiancé Mark was nowhere in sight. My father sat in the front row, scrolling through his phone. And my older sister leaned toward my mother and said, not quietly enough, "Just don't tell her yet. She'll ruin everything." They were talking about me. They always were. My name is Eleanor Price. I was 31 years old, engaged, financially independent, and about to learn that none of that mattered inside my family. I grew up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, in a house that looked perfect from the street. White siding, blue shutters, hydrangeas trimmed within an inch of their lives. Inside, everything ran on a system no one ever explained to me directly, but I learned to follow early. My parents, Robert and Susan Price, believed in appearances. My sister Victoria believed in hierarchy. And I believed, for far too long, that if I stayed agreeable, useful, and quiet, I would be protected. I was wrong. It's important to understand that nothing in my family ever exploded all at once. There were no screaming matches or dramatic ultimatums. Everything was done softly, politely, with smiles and phrases like, "We just think this makes sense," or, "You'll understand when you're older." I was the younger daughter, the reliable one, the one who remembered birthdays, filled out paperwork, handled logistics. Victoria was the shining one, the one my parents spoke about with pride, the one who had always known how to take up space. When we were kids, she got piano lessons and writing lessons. I got told to be grateful for what I had. When we were teenagers, her mistakes were phases. Mine were character flaws. When we became adults, her ambition was leadership. Mine was inconvenience. I didn't see it clearly at first. Favoritism is invisible when you're standing inside it. After college, I moved to Boston and built a career in corporate compliance. Not glamorous, but solid. I worked with contracts, regulations, risk. I learned how systems actually functioned beneath the surface. I learned how people protected themselves with paperwork. Meanwhile, my family ran a mid-sized event venue business back home. The kind that hosted weddings, charity galas, corporate retreats, the Price Estate. A restored colonial property with a ballroom and manicured grounds. It had been my grandmother's home before it became a business. My grandmother, Margaret Price, was the only person in my family who ever looked at me and paused, like she was actually seeing something. She died when I was 26. At the time, my parents told me not to worry about her will. "Everything's handled," my father said. "Victoria's managing the estate matters." That should have been my first warning, but I trusted them. By the time I got engaged to Mark, the family business had expanded. New investors, new partnerships. Victoria was officially listed as managing director. My parents were still the owners, on paper. Unofficially, things were shifting. My wedding was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became a pressure point. From the moment we announced the date, my family began inserting themselves into decisions that weren't theirs. Venue, guest list, vendors. Every suggestion came with the same justification. It's better for the family image. At first, I compromised. I let my mother invite distant relatives I barely knew. I allowed my father to insist on hosting the rehearsal dinner at the Price Estate, even though Mark and I had planned something smaller. Then came the guest list conversation. We were sitting in my parents' dining room. My mother had her notepad. Victoria sat beside her, flipping through names like a judge. "We need to remove some of Mark's friends," my mother said calmly. "We're over capacity." "The venue holds 200, I replied. "We're at 190. "Yes, but we need flexibility," Victoria added. "For business associates." I looked at her. "Business associates?" She smiled like I was slow. "The wedding is a networking opportunity, Eleanor. You understand that." I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. That was my mistake. The rehearsal day arrived with rain in the forecast, and tension already humming beneath the surface. I noticed small things first. How my seating chart had been changed without my knowledge. How my name was misspelled on a printed program. How Mark kept getting pulled aside by my father for quick chats that lasted far too long. Then I overheard the sentence that broke the illusion. "Just don't tell her yet." I stepped closer without making a sound. Years of learning how to stay invisible had taught me how. What if she asks? My mother whispered. She won't, Victoria replied. She never does. My chest tightened. After the wedding, my father said. Everything will be finalized by then. What will? I asked. All three of them turned toward me. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was calculated. My mother recovered first. Sweetheart, you weren't supposed to hear that. Victoria tilted her head, studying me. This is exactly why we didn't want to tell you yet. Tell me what? I asked. My father sighed like I'd inconvenienced him. We're restructuring ownership of the estate. I blinked. Okay. And because you're getting married, my mother added, it complicates things. Complicates what? Victoria spoke carefully. The inheritance. The word landed like a weight. You were always going to be taken care of, she continued. But the business needs clarity, stability. I waited. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. So, my father said, we're transferring full ownership to Victoria before the wedding. My mouth went dry. What about me? My mother smiled, tight and reassuring. You'll receive a gift, a generous one. A gift, not a share, not a right. I looked at all three of them and understood something with terrifying clarity. They weren't telling me because they knew I might say no. And for the first time in my life, I realized love in my family had always been conditional. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I nodded. Okay, I said. Victoria relaxed. My mother reached for my hand. My father checked his watch. They thought it was over. They had no idea that the moment I stopped speaking was the moment I started paying attention. And I had spent my entire career learning exactly how power really worked. The night after the rehearsal, I didn't sleep. Not because I was crying or panicking. I lay awake because something in my mind had switched from emotion to assessment. It was the same mental shift I'd learned at work when a compliance issue surfaced. You stop reacting and start mapping. What exactly had they decided? When had they decided it? And how long had I been the only one in the dark? The next morning, my mother texted me like nothing had happened. Hope you slept well. Big day tomorrow. Love you. I stared at the message, then set my phone face down. Mark noticed immediately. He always did. You're quiet, he said, as we sat at the kitchen table in our apartment, coffee untouched between us. I considered how much to tell him. I didn't want to sound dramatic. I didn't want to contaminate our wedding day with family drama. That instinct ran deep. They're transferring ownership of the Price estate to Victoria, I said calmly, before the wedding. Mark frowned. Isn't that your grandmother's house? Yes. And didn't she tell you? She told me she wanted things to be fair, I said. But I never saw the will. That stopped him. You never saw it? No. He leaned back slowly. Eleanor, that's not normal. I know. There was a long pause. They're saying it's because you're getting married? He asked. Yes. And what happens to you? They'll give me a gift. Mark let out a short breath. That's not a reason. That's an excuse. I nodded. I think they've been planning this for a while. What are you going to do? The old answer rose automatically. Keep the peace. Don't cause a scene. Let it go. I surprised myself. I'm not sure yet, I said, but I'm not agreeing to anything. The wedding happened the next day under clear skies and forced smiles. If you were an outsider, you would have thought it was perfect. The venue glowed. Guests complimented the decor. My parents played gracious hosts. Victoria gave a toast that mentioned legacy and continuity more than love. I watched it all like someone observing a familiar play with new eyes. Small things stood out. How my parents introduced Victoria to guests as the future owner. How my name came second, if at all. How the estate manager deferred to her on every decision, even ones that used to go through my father. No one said anything to me directly. That was the pattern. Silence as strategy. After the wedding, we left for a short honeymoon. A rented cabin in Vermont. No phones, no obligations. On the second night, sitting by the fire, Mark asked me something that shifted everything. What if you weren't wrong to be angry? He said. I looked at him. I'm not angry. He raised an eyebrow. You're focused. I smiled faintly. That's worse. When we got back, the first letter was waiting. Not a conversation, not a meeting request. A letter from my parents' attorney. It congratulated me on my marriage and outlined the updated estate structure. It confirmed that full ownership of the Price estate had been transferred to Victoria. It included a clause noting that I would receive a one-time distribution at a later date. No amount specified. No timeline. I read it twice, then handed it to Mark. They didn't even ask, he said quietly. No, I replied. They informed. That night, I opened a new folder on my laptop. Family. Inside it, I created subfolders. Grandmother. Estate. Business filings. Emails. I started with public records. The Price estate had changed ownership 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks before the rehearsal. They hadn't just waited to tell me. They had already done it. I felt something tighten in my chest, then settle into something colder. They didn't trust me enough to include me. They didn't fear hurting me. They feared me objecting. That meant they thought I had leverage. I began requesting documents. Casually at first. I emailed my father asking for a copy of Grandma Margaret's will for my records. He replied 2 days later, "Everything is handled. No need to worry about that now." That answer told me everything. I called the probate court in Fairfield County. My grandmother's estate had been closed quickly. Too quickly. The filings listed Victoria as executor. I requested copies. There was a delay. Then paperwork arrived. I sat at my desk, reading slowly, carefully. The will was there, and so was something else. A codicil, dated 6 months before my grandmother died. It wasn't mentioned anywhere in my parents' letter. The codicil changed several things. It specified that the Price estate property could not be transferred or sold without the consent of all named heirs. There were 2 names, Victoria Price, Eleanor Price. My hands went still. They hadn't just excluded me, they had bypassed me, which meant the transfer might not be valid. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confront anyone. I did what I always did when something serious surfaced. I called a lawyer. Her name was Diane Holloway. She specialized in estate disputes and corporate governance. She didn't interrupt as I explained. She didn't gasp or react emotionally. When I finished, she said one sentence that changed the direction of my life. "They didn't just hurt you," she said. "They took a risk." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of risk?" "The kind people take when they assume someone will stay quiet," she replied. Outside, the world kept moving. My parents hosted dinners. Victoria posted photos from the estate, calling it my new chapter. Relatives congratulated her publicly. No one asked how I felt. I stopped expecting them to. Instead, I started preparing. Because betrayal isn't loud when it comes from family. It's procedural. And once you see that, you stop reacting to words and start reading documents. Diane didn't rush me. That was the first thing I noticed. In our first in-person meeting, she let the silence stretch after I finished explaining everything. She read the documents again, slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. People who rush usually want something from you. People who take their time are usually dangerous. "This codicil," she said finally, tapping the page with her pen, "was properly executed, witnessed, filed, and conveniently ignored." "Can they do that?" I asked. "They can try," she replied, "but ignoring it doesn't make it disappear." I stared at the legal language, my grandmother's signature at the bottom, slightly shaky but unmistakable. I hadn't seen her handwriting in years. Seeing it now felt like a quiet hand on my shoulder. "Why wouldn't they mention it?" I asked. Diane didn't sugarcoat it. "Because it limits their control." That word again. Control. I thought back to the rehearsal dinner. The whispers. The timing. The way they spoke as if the decision had already been absorbed by the universe. They hadn't expected resistance. "What are my options?" I asked. Diane leaned back. "You could challenge the transfer. You could request an injunction. You could force a formal accounting of the estate and the business." "And what happens then?" Her eyes held mine. "Things get uncomfortable." I exhaled. "For them or for me?" She smiled faintly. "Both. But only one of you is protected by the law." I didn't answer right away. I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past the windshield. Mark was out when I arrived, so I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where we'd once planned our guest list, blissfully unaware of what was already unfolding behind my back. Uncomfortable. That word followed me for days. My family thrived on discomfort avoidance. Everything was designed to smooth over tension, bury conflict, preserve the image. They didn't confront problems. They managed perception. If I acted, that illusion would crack. The question wasn't whether I could do it. It was whether I was willing to become the problem. Victoria called me that Friday. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. I wanted to check in. "You've been a little distant." I pictured her walking through the estate, keys in hand, already settled into ownership she hadn't fully earned. "I've been busy," I said. "Of course. Married life." She laughed softly. "Listen, Mom and Dad mentioned you had some questions about the estate paperwork." "I did," I replied. "Well," she said smoothly, "there's really nothing to worry about. Everything was handled legally." I let the silence hang just long enough. "Did you know about the codicil?" I asked. Her breath caught. Just barely. "What codicil?" she said. That was the moment I knew. "You should ask the probate court," I said calmly. "They have it on file." She didn't respond right away. "Eleanor," she said finally, and her tone shifted. "Why are you digging into this now?" "Because you hid it. Because you thought I wouldn't look. Because you assumed I'd accept a gift instead of a right." I didn't say any of that. "I'm reviewing my records," I said. "You're married now," she pressed. "Why stir this up?" There it was. The implication. That marriage made me less entitled, less independent, less relevant. "I didn't realize marriage canceled inheritance rights," I said evenly. Her voice cooled. "You're overthinking this." "I don't think I am." She sighed, the way she always did when I didn't fall in line. "Let's talk about this in person." "No," I said. The word surprised both of us. "No?" she repeated. "I prefer things in writing," I added. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. "We're family," she said finally. "This doesn't need to be adversarial." I almost laughed. "You're right," I said. It didn't. When the call ended, my hands were steady. That was new. The first letter from Diane went out the following Monday. Formal, polite, precise. It requested confirmation of the legal basis for the ownership transfer and included a copy of the codicil. It asked for documentation demonstrating my consent as required. There was no accusation, no threat, just facts. My parents didn't respond. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th day, my mother called. Her voice was strained. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm asking questions," I said. "You're upsetting your father," she said. "This was supposed to be a happy time." "For who?" I asked. She ignored that. "Victoria has taken on so much responsibility. You know how stressful this is for her." I pictured Victoria standing at the head of the table, directing staff, giving interviews. "I didn't realize responsibility excluded accountability," I said. My mother's voice hardened. "This isn't how family handles things." I paused. "This is how professionals do," I replied. She hung up. The second letter from Diane went out a week later. This one referenced statutory requirements, deadlines, consequences of non-response. That's when the tone changed. My father emailed me directly, for the first time in months. "You're being manipulated. This lawyer is turning you against your own family." I read it once. Then I forwarded it to Diane. Her reply was immediate. "Let them talk. We'll let the documents speak." At night, I lay awake thinking about my grandmother, how she used to ask me questions about my job, how she once said, "You notice things other people don't. Don't let them make you doubt that." Had she known this would happen? Had she seen the imbalance long before I did? The answer sat in the codicil. She had known, and she had planned. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my apartment. Inside were partial documents, incomplete, selective. Diane reviewed them and shook her head. "They're stalling," she said, "and they've made a mistake." "What kind?" "They acknowledge the codicil exists," she replied, without explaining why they ignored it. I felt something click into place. What does that mean? It means they can't pretend this was accidental anymore. For the first time since the rehearsal dinner, I felt the balance shift. They still had the estate. They still had the narrative. But I had something they didn't expect. Time and proof, and the patience to let them underestimate me just a little longer. Because the quietest form of revenge isn't confrontation, it's documentation. And the people who rely on silence rarely survive it once it breaks. The first meeting they requested after Diane's second letter wasn't framed as a negotiation. It was framed as concern. My mother emailed asking if we could sit down as a family and clear up misunderstandings. She suggested Sunday afternoon at the house. No lawyers, no paperwork, just conversation. That phrasing told me everything. They didn't want resolution. They wanted containment. I agreed to meet, with one condition. I would bring Mark, not as muscle, as a witness. They didn't respond to that condition, but they didn't object either. Sunday came with clear skies and the kind of crisp air that makes people nostalgic. The house looked exactly as it always had. Same wreath on the door, same polished wood floors, same framed photos that skipped entire phases of my life. Victoria was already there when we arrived, seated in my father's chair like it had always belonged to her. She stood when she saw me, her smile practiced. Ellie. I hadn't been called that since childhood. Mark squeezed my hand once before letting go. We sat. My father cleared his throat. "We're disappointed," he said, opening with judgment rather than welcome. I nodded. I imagined you would be. My mother shot him a look, then turned to me. "This didn't have to get legal." "It didn't," I said. "You chose that." Victoria leaned forward. "This is getting blown out of proportion." I looked at her. "Then it should be easy to fix." Silence. My father spoke next. "Your grandmother trusted us to handle things, and she trusted me enough to put my name on the codicil," I replied. That landed harder than I expected. My mother's face tightened. "We didn't think it applied," she said quickly. I tilted my head. "Based on what?" No one answered. Victoria crossed her arms. "You're married now. Things change." "There it is," Mark said quietly. All three of them turned to him, surprised he'd spoken. "What do you mean?" my mother asked. "He means you're implying Eleanor's marital status makes her less entitled," Mark said. Calm, direct. "That's not how inheritance law works." My father bristled. "This is family business." "No," I said. "This is business. Family is how you're framing it to avoid accountability." Victoria laughed sharply. "You always had a chip on your shoulder." I didn't react. "I had boundaries you didn't respect," I said. Her smile faded. My mother leaned forward, lowering her voice. "What do you want?" It was the same question she'd asked my grandmother's lawyer years ago, according to the notes Diane had uncovered. "What do you want?" As if fairness were a negotiation tactic. "I want compliance with the will," I said. "Nothing more, nothing less." My father slammed his hand on the armrest. "This estate is my life's work." "And it was her home," I replied. "Both can be true." He stared at me like I'd betrayed him. "You're tearing this family apart," he said. I met his gaze steadily. "I didn't start this. I just stopped pretending not to see it." Victoria stood abruptly. "You think you're smarter than us because you work in compliance." I smiled faintly. "No, I think I'm patient," she scoffed. "You won't win." "I don't need to," I said. "I just need the process." The meeting ended without resolution. No agreement. No apology. But something had changed. They were no longer confident. The following week, Diane filed a formal request for injunction. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone of fraud outright. It simply asked the court to pause any further transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the Price estate until the ownership dispute was resolved. The judge granted it within 48 hours. Victoria lost the ability to act unilaterally. That's when the pressure started. Relatives began calling. An aunt asked why I was doing this to my parents. A cousin said I should let it go for the sake of peace. I thanked them for their concern and changed the subject. At work, I functioned normally. I met deadlines, reviewed contracts, led meetings. At night, I read filings. Diane uncovered something else buried in the estate documents. A loan, taken out against the property 6 months before my grandmother died. Victoria's signature was on it. So was my father's. The funds hadn't gone into maintenance. They'd gone into expansion. A new wing. A risky investment. One that hadn't yet paid off. The estate wasn't just a legacy. It was leveraged. They needed full control, Diane said. Shared ownership would have required disclosure. My stomach tightened. Not with fear, but with clarity. They weren't just excluding me, I said. They were protecting themselves. Yes, she replied. And now, that protection is cracking. We didn't act on the loan immediately. We waited, because timing matters more than truth when power is involved. Then, one Thursday morning, I received an email from Victoria marked urgent. "We need to talk. Now." I didn't respond. An hour later, my father called. I let it ring. At noon, my mother texted, "Please, This is serious. I replied with one sentence. Have your attorney contact mine. That afternoon, Diane received a frantic call from their legal counsel. The loan terms had triggered a covenant review. Without clear ownership, the lender was nervous. Very nervous. Diane listened, asked a few questions, and said, "All communication goes through me." When she hung up, she looked at me. "They're about to feel what it's like to lose control," she said. I didn't smile. I felt something else. Relief. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family's decisions. I was letting the structure they built collapse under its own weight. And I was standing outside of it, steady, watching the balance finally tip. The shift didn't announce itself with shouting or threats. It arrived the way real consequences usually do, quietly, through other people. The lender's review triggered a chain reaction my family hadn't anticipated. The injunction meant Victoria couldn't refinance. The unresolved ownership meant the bank couldn't confirm authority. And the outstanding loan meant time was suddenly expensive. Diane didn't call it leverage. She called it gravity. Once things start falling, she said, no one gets to decide how fast. My parents' attorney reached out first, proposing a temporary compromise. He suggested granting me a symbolic minority interest in exchange for lifting the injunction. Symbolic was the word he used. I declined. Not emotionally. Practically. There's no mechanism for symbolic ownership, Diane replied on my behalf. Either the will is followed or it isn't. Victoria stopped calling me after that. Instead, she started calling Mark. He told me immediately. Every time. She wants me to talk you down, he said one night. She keeps saying you don't understand what you're risking. I looked up from my laptop. What did you tell her? That you understand exactly what you're doing, he replied, and that she should talk to her lawyer. Good answer. The pressure increased in subtler ways. My mother sent photos. Old ones, holidays, birthdays. Me standing slightly behind everyone else, holding a plate, smiling like I belonged. I didn't respond. An uncle wrote a long email about family loyalty and how my grandmother would be disappointed. I forwarded it to Diane and archived it. The hardest moment came unexpectedly. I was sorting through documents late one night when I found an email thread from years earlier. My grandmother writing to my father, asking why I hadn't been included in a meeting about the estate's future. His reply was short. She doesn't need to worry about those things. I stared at the sentence until my eyes burned. That wasn't love. That was erasure. The following week, Diane scheduled a formal mediation session. Court ordered. Mandatory. Neutral location. Conference room. Everyone present. Attorneys included. I arrived early. Sat quietly. Took notes. My parents arrived together. Victoria came separately. She didn't look at me. The mediator explained the process. Everyone nodded like they'd done this before. Victoria's attorney spoke first. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding, compounded by grief and poor communication. He emphasized my parents' intentions, their sacrifices, their stress. When it was Diane's turn, she didn't counter emotionally. She laid out the timeline. Dates, filings, transfers, the codicil, the loan, the injunction. No adjectives, no accusations, just facts. When she finished, the mediator turned to Victoria. Do you dispute the existence or validity of the codicil? He asked. Victoria hesitated. No, she said. Do you dispute that consent from both heirs was required? He continued. She glanced at her attorney. No. The room went very quiet. My father shifted in his chair. My mother stared at the table. So, the mediator said carefully, the transfer occurred without proper authority. Victoria's attorney leaned forward. It was an oversight. Diane smiled politely. Oversights don't usually involve bypassing required signatures. The mediator cleared his throat. We're not here to determine intent. We're here to determine resolution. He turned to me. What outcome are you seeking? I didn't rush. I want the will honored, I said. And I want transparency going forward. Transparency in what sense? He asked. Full accounting of the estate and business operations, I replied. Past and present. Victoria laughed under her breath. I looked at her. You don't get to be offended by scrutiny when you asked for control. Her face flushed. The mediator raised a hand. Let's stay constructive. My father finally spoke. This is destroying everything. I turned to him. It was already broken. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. The mediation ended without agreement. But something important had happened. The facts were now on record. 2 days later, the lender issued a formal notice. Without resolution, the loan could be called. That's when my parents panicked. My mother called me crying for the first time in years. Real tears, not strategic ones. "You're going to lose the house," she said. "Our grandmother's house," I corrected gently. "Please," she whispered. "We can't do this." I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I said, "You should talk to Diane." She hung up. That night, Mark asked me something I hadn't considered. "Do you want the estate?" he asked. I thought about it. "I want what my grandmother intended," I said, "not what they used it for." The next proposal came through attorneys. Joint ownership, equal shares, independent oversight, a formal operating agreement. It was the first time they offered something that resembled fairness. Diane reviewed it carefully. "They're trying to save themselves," she said. "But this is closer." "Closer isn't enough," I replied. We countered. Stricter terms, clear exit options, mandatory audits, my consent required for any debt or sale. When the response came back, Victoria had added a handwritten note at the bottom of the document. "You don't have to do this." I stared at the words. She still thought this was about choice. I handed the document back to Diane. "We proceed," I said. At home, late that night, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, resolve. Because for the first time, my family couldn't talk their way out of consequences. They couldn't guilt me into silence. They couldn't move forward without me. And they were finally learning what it felt like to be excluded from a decision that affected their future. Only this time, it wasn't accidental. It was lawful. And it was earned. The weeks after the failed mediation felt suspended, like everyone was holding their breath and waiting for me to blink. I didn't. Instead, I settled into a routine that felt almost unsettling in its calm. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I slept through the night. While my family spiraled, I stayed steady, and that contrast alone seemed to unnerve them. Diane called it positional advantage. I thought of it as no longer volunteering for pain. The lender's deadline loomed. 30 days to resolve the ownership dispute or face acceleration of the loan. Suddenly, the urgency that had never applied to my feelings applied to their finances. Victoria sent no more emotional messages. Everything now went through attorneys. That was another shift. People stop pretending things are personal when the stakes become real. Diane and I met twice that week to prepare for the next step. She spread documents across her conference table like a map of a battlefield already shaped by past decisions. "They used the estate as collateral," she said, tapping the loan agreement. "Without your consent." "Yes," I said. "If this goes to court," she continued, "a judge will want to know why." I already knew the answer. Because they thought I wouldn't matter. "What happens if the loan is called?" I asked. She didn't soften it. "They'd have to refinance quickly or sell assets, possibly the estate itself." I pictured the house, the long driveway, the ballroom where my wedding reception had been staged like a corporate event. I felt no rush of satisfaction. Just clarity. "Do you want that?" Diane asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I want leverage," I said. "Not destruction." She nodded. Then we used the clock. The next move wasn't dramatic. We filed a petition for formal accounting. It required my parents and Victoria to disclose full financial records related to the estate and the business for the past 5 years. All of it. Expenses, income, transfers, loans. The reaction was immediate. My father called, furious. "You're humiliating us," he snapped. "I'm asking for records," I replied. "That's not humiliation. That's governance." "You've turned this into a war," he said. "No," I said calmly. "You did when you cut me out. I'm just responding." He hung up on me. That evening, my mother emailed me a long message about stress, health, and regret. She wrote about sleepless nights, about how none of this was what she wanted. I read it once, then replied with 3 sentences. "I understand this is hard. I'm not acting out of spite. Please communicate through counsel." It felt cold. It wasn't. It was necessary. The documents began arriving in batches. Some were complete. Some weren't. Diane flagged inconsistencies immediately. Expenses categorized vaguely. Transfers without explanation. Vendor payments routed through personal accounts. This is sloppy, she said. Or intentional. Which is worse? I asked. She didn't answer. Victoria finally broke her silence 2 weeks before the lender's deadline. She showed up at my apartment. No warning, no call. I opened the door and saw her standing there, coat unbuttoned, hair pulled back too tightly. She looked exhausted. I just want to talk, she said. I didn't move aside. We can talk, I said. With Diane present, her jaw tightened. You don't need a lawyer for everything. Yes, I replied. I do. She laughed bitterly. You've changed. I met her gaze. No, I've stopped adjusting. She stared at me, then shook her head. You think you're winning. I think I'm protecting myself, I said. You're going to lose the estate, she snapped. Do you want that on your conscience? I took a breath. I didn't borrow against it. That landed. Her shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time, she looked uncertain. We can fix this, she said, quieter now. You sign off on the transfer retroactively. We refinance. Everyone moves on. And what do I get? I asked. She hesitated. Security. I almost smiled. I already have that, I said. What I don't have is trust. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. You were never like this, she said. I thought about that. You were never listening, I replied. She left without another word. That night, Mark poured us both a glass of wine and sat beside me on the couch. You okay? He asked. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how true it felt. A week later, the lender requested a meeting. Neutral office. Their counsel. Diane. Me. My parents weren't invited. That alone said everything. The lender's representative was polite but direct. We need clarity on ownership and authority. Diane laid out the situation. Calm, precise. The representative turned to me. Would you consent to a temporary restructuring if additional safeguards were in place? I looked at Diane, then back at him. Possibly, I said. Under conditions. Those conditions became the framework for the first real shift. Independent trustee. External financial oversight. No new debt without unanimous consent. A clear path for separation if the business couldn't sustain itself. The lender listened carefully. When the meeting ended, Diane smiled for the first time in weeks. They can't move without you now, she said. I didn't feel powerful. I felt anchored. At home that evening, I found myself thinking about my grandmother again. About how she used to say, stability isn't loud, it's consistent. That's what I was building. Not revenge, not spectacle, structure. And structure has a way of revealing who was never meant to hold it alone. The deadline came and went. The loan wasn't called. The estate didn't collapse, but something else did. The illusion that my family could make decisions without me and call it love. They were now operating inside rules they couldn't bend, and I was no longer waiting to be included. I was already inside the system, watching, deciding. Once the lender stepped in, the tone shifted from emotional to procedural. That was when my parents truly began to understand what they'd lost. Not the estate, not the business. Control. The independent trustee was appointed within a week. His name was Alan Weiss, a former corporate restructuring advisor in his early 60s, with no patience for family dynamics. He asked for documents, deadlines, and compliance. He did not ask how anyone felt. Victoria hated him immediately. At the first joint call, she tried to explain context, history, intentions. Alan cut her off mid-sentence. I'm not here to preserve anyone's narrative, he said. I'm here to protect the asset. I watched her face on the screen, the frustration, the disbelief. She had never been spoken to like that in her life. For the first time, we were equals in the room, and she couldn't handle it. The accounting review accelerated. Alan's team flagged issues Diane and I had suspected, but hadn't yet proven. Vendor contracts routed through personal LLCs. Expense reimbursements without documentation. Loans repaid from estate revenue without board approval. Nothing explosive on its own, but together it painted a picture of entitlement, dressed up as stewardship. My father called me late one night, voice low, urgent. This has gone too far, he said. I was sitting at my kitchen table, tea growing cold in my hands. It went too far when you signed my name out of existence, I replied. You don't understand what you're risking, he said. I closed my eyes. No, I said quietly. You don't understand what I already lost. He didn't respond. The next morning, Diane forwarded me an email from Alan. Preliminary findings suggest the estate may not be solvent under current management. Recommendation: restructuring or divestment. I read it twice. Then I sat back and let the weight of it settle. The estate wasn't sacred. It was unsustainable. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't about reclaiming a home or preserving a legacy. It was about preventing further damage, about stopping a slow bleed that had been hidden behind polished floors and catered events. Victoria refused to accept that. She pushed back on every finding, challenged every recommendation, accused Alan of bias, accused Diane of manipulation. At one point during a conference call, she snapped. This wouldn't be happening if Eleanor had just stayed out of it. Alan responded without missing a beat. This is happening because proper governance was ignored, he said. Your sister's involvement is incidental. I muted myself so she wouldn't see me exhale. That night, my mother showed up at my apartment. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. I just want to see you, she said. I let her in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same one where Mark and I had planned our future, without knowing how much of the past was already rigged against me. I don't recognize this family anymore, she said. I folded my hands. Neither do I. She looked at me then. Really looked. When did you become so distant? She asked. I thought about it. I didn't, I said. I just stopped absorbing things for you. She winced. Victoria is drowning, she said. I nodded. She's been swimming in water she didn't check the depth of. My mother reached across the table, then stopped herself. We thought you'd be safer this way, she said. That word again. Safer. You thought I'd be quieter, I replied. Her eyes filled with tears. We didn't mean to hurt you. I believe that, I said. But intent doesn't undo outcome. She stayed for an hour. We talked about neutral things. The weather. A neighbor who'd moved away. She didn't ask me to stop. She didn't apologize. She left, looking tired. 2 weeks later, Alan issued a formal recommendation. Sell the estate. Not immediately, not in panic, but strategically. The business model no longer supported the debt. The maintenance costs were escalating. The market was favorable. The price estate could be sold at a premium. Victoria lost it. She called an emergency meeting, demanded I block the recommendation. You can't let this happen, she said, voice shaking. This is our history. This is our liability, I replied. My father slammed his hand on the table. You're choosing money over family. I looked at him. You chose debt over transparency, I said. This is the result. Alan cleared his throat. We need a decision. All eyes turned to me. This was the moment they had avoided for years. The moment where my consent actually mattered. I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd turned a home into something that served the community without exploiting it. About how she'd warned me once that buildings don't hold families together. Choices do. I support the sale, I said. Victoria stared at me like I'd struck her. You can't, she whispered. I can, I replied. And I am. The meeting ended abruptly. The fallout was immediate. My father stopped speaking to me entirely. My mother sent one final message asking if I was sure. I didn't respond. The listing went live quietly. No announcement, no fanfare. A private offering. Within 10 days, there were 3 interested buyers. One of them was a preservation group. Another was a hospitality firm. The third was an investment company with plans to subdivide. Alan favored the preservation group. So did I. Victoria wanted the highest bidder. For once, she didn't get her way. The sale closed 6 weeks later. The Price estate was no longer ours. The proceeds paid off the loan, covered outstanding obligations, left a remainder. A clean break. At the final signing, I watched Victoria sign her name with trembling hands. She didn't look at me. When it was my turn, I signed steadily, not because it felt good, but because it felt right. Outside, the air was crisp, clear. Mark was waiting for me on the steps. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded. I think this is what closure actually looks like. That night, I slept without dreams. For the first time in months, nothing was pending. No documents waiting to be signed. No calls I was bracing for. Just space. I didn't know yet what would fill it, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever came next would be built on consent, not silence, not sacrifice, and not the illusion of love that disappears the moment you stop complying. After the sale closed, everything went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar and heavy. Not peaceful. Not yet, just empty. The estate had been the axis my family revolved around for decades. Once it was gone, there was no obvious place to gather, no shared project to argue over, no excuse to call each other pretending it was about logistics. The silence wasn't accidental. It was structural. The proceeds were distributed according to the will and the revised agreement Alan had enforced. Clean numbers, clear transfers, no favors, no adjustments. The money landed in my account on a Tuesday morning. I stared at the balance for a long time. It wasn't life-changing wealth, but it was substantial. More than the gift they'd once promised me. Less than what the estate would have been worth if it hadn't been mismanaged. It represented something far more important than money. Proof. Proof that my grandmother's voice had survived their decisions. Proof that my role in the family hadn't been symbolic, no matter how hard they tried to make it so. Mark came home early that day. He didn't ask how much. He didn't ask what I planned to do with it. He just hugged me and said, "You don't look tense anymore." He was right. The tension that had lived between my shoulders for years was gone. In its place was something quieter, heavier, but steadier. 2 days later, Victoria called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was flat, controlled. "I assume you're happy." I considered the question. "I'm relieved," I said. "That's different." She exhaled sharply. "You destroyed everything." I didn't interrupt. "That house was our identity," she continued. "Without it, we're just people." I waited. "You always wanted this," she said finally. "You always wanted to take it from me." That was the lie she needed to survive. "No," I said. "I wanted honesty. You wanted control. We both got consequences." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think this ends well for you?" "I think it ends honestly," I replied. There was a pause. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I thought about it. "I'm going to live my life without managing yours," I said. She hung up. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. The months that followed forced all of us into smaller lives. My parents downsized. Quietly. No announcement. They moved into a condominium near the water, far from the social circles that had revolved around the estate. My mother stopped calling. My father never reached out again. Victoria tried to start a new venture, an event consulting firm. She announced it on social media with confidence that felt forced. Within weeks, the posts stopped. I didn't ask questions. At work, something unexpected happened. I was offered a promotion. Senior Compliance Director. More authority. More autonomy. During the meeting, my supervisor said something that stuck with me. "You're very calm under pressure," she said. "You don't personalize conflict." I almost laughed. I accepted the role. With the money from the estate, I paid off my student loans. We renovated our apartment kitchen. I set aside a portion in a separate account labeled simply Margaret, not as a shrine. As a reminder, one evening, sorting through old files, I found a letter I'd never opened. It had been tucked into the folder of estate documents Diane had sent me months earlier. It was handwritten. My grandmother's handwriting. The date was a year before she died. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something has happened that required you to look more closely than you ever wanted to. I'm sorry for that. Families don't like being examined. I need you to know that what you feel is not imagination. It's perception. And perception is a form of intelligence. I did what I could within the limits I was given. The rest, I trust to you. Love, Margaret." I sat at the table and let the words sink in. She hadn't just left me an inheritance. She'd left me permission. The holidays came and went quietly. No Thanksgiving dinner, no Christmas gathering. Mark and I spent them alone, cooking simple meals, walking the city, creating traditions that didn't come with expectations attached. On New Year's Eve, we stood on our balcony, watching fireworks bloom over the river. "Do you miss them?" Mark asked. I thought carefully. "I miss who I thought they were," I said, "not who they showed themselves to be." That felt honest. In February, Diane invited me to lunch. "I wanted to check in," she said. Clients sometimes feel untethered after something like this. I smiled. I feel grounded. She nodded approvingly. That's rare. Before we parted, she said something I hadn't expected. You were never the difficult one, she said. You were the inconvenient one. There's a difference. I carried that sentence with me for weeks. In March, I received one final email from my mother. It was short. I hope you're well. No apology, no explanation, no request. I replied with one line. I am. And I meant it. Because what I'd learned, finally, was this. Losing your place in a system built on control isn't loss, it's release. When the structure collapses, the people who relied on it scramble. The ones who never belonged walk away lighter. I didn't get justice in the way movies promise. I got something better. Distance, clarity, and a life no longer shaped by rooms I wasn't allowed to speak in. Spring brought motion back into my life. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but quietly rearranges things. With the estate gone and the legal tension resolved, there was no longer a central crisis demanding my attention. That absence felt strange at first. I'd grown used to monitoring emails, bracing for calls, measuring time in deadlines and filings. Now, there was just space. I didn't rush to fill it. At work, the promotion settled in. I led a small team, redesigned internal controls, and pushed for changes that had been stalled for years. People listened to me differently now, not because I spoke louder, but because I didn't hesitate. Power, I was learning, isn't volume. It's certainty. One afternoon, my supervisor stopped by my office. You don't over-explain, she said. That's rare, I smiled. I used to. She nodded like she understood more than she said. The first real test of my new life came unexpectedly. An invitation arrived in the mail. Victoria's name was on it. A launch event. Her new consulting firm. Wine reception. Downtown venue. I held the envelope for a long moment before tossing it in the recycling bin. No anger. No second guessing. Just clarity, Mark noticed. No curiosity? I already know how that story goes, I said. Instead, I spent that evening walking through the city alone, thinking about how many hours of my life I'd spent trying to be included in rooms that drained me. I didn't miss them. In April, my father was hospitalized. I found out through an aunt, not directly. He asked about you, she said carefully. I thanked her for telling me and didn't ask for details. Mark waited until we were home before asking, "Do you want to go?" I thought about it longer than I expected. No, I said. Not because I don't care, because I finally understand what caring costs me. He nodded. He didn't argue. My mother didn't reach out. That silence felt final, in a way nothing else had. At the end of the month, I received a notification from the probate court. The estate file was officially closed. No loose ends. No pending disputes. I stared at the confirmation screen and felt something settle inside me. Completion. That same week, I made a decision I hadn't planned. I resigned from my job. Not abruptly, not dramatically. I gave notice, prepared transition documents, trained my replacement. When my supervisor asked why, I told her the truth. I want to build something where I don't inherit broken systems, I said. I want to design them. She studied me for a moment, then smiled. Let me know when you do. Using part of the estate funds, I partnered with a former colleague to start a small consulting practice. Governance, compliance, family-owned businesses. The work felt almost poetic, helping other people avoid the mistakes my family refused to acknowledge. Our first client was a second-generation company on the brink of collapse. Too many unspoken assumptions. Too much loyalty mistaken for structure. During our first meeting, the founder's daughter looked at me across the table and said, "I feel invisible." I met her gaze. "You're not." I meant it. Victoria's firm folded by summer. I heard it from someone else. I didn't look it up. Some endings don't need witnesses. One evening in June, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was tired, older than I remembered. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she said. I leaned against the counter, listening. "You don't have to," I replied gently. "We don't need to force something that isn't there." She was quiet for a long time. "I thought doing what was practical was the same as doing what was right," she said. "That's a common mistake," I said. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It wasn't the apology I once dreamed of. It didn't fix anything, but it was real. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. We ended the call, without promises. That night, I realized something important. Closure doesn't come from resolution. It comes from recognition. By late summer, my life felt smaller and more intentional. Fewer obligations, fewer explanations, more truth. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices to anyone who hadn't protected me when it mattered. The story of my family didn't end in reconciliation. It ended in understanding, and that understanding freed me in ways love never had. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight. It's to step back, take your name with you, and let the structure that erased you collapse under its own weight. The first year without my family's orbit was quieter than I expected. Not empty, just unweighted. My consulting practice grew slowly, intentionally. I chose clients the way I chose relationships now, with curiosity, but no obligation. If something felt misaligned, I declined without apology. That alone felt like a skill I'd earned the hard way. One morning in early September, a client canceled a meeting last minute. I found myself with an unscheduled hour and nowhere to rush to. I walked to a small cafe near the river, ordered coffee, and sat by the window watching people pass. I realized I wasn't waiting for anything. No call, no shoe to drop, no crisis. That awareness was unsettling at first. Then it was liberating. Mark noticed the change too. "You don't scan rooms anymore," he said one evening. "You used to." I thought about it. About how I used to track moods, anticipate reactions, preempt disappointment. "I don't need to manage people now," I said. "I just listen." In October, my father died. A stroke. Sudden, according to the message from my aunt. I sat with the news longer than I expected. Not because I regretted anything. Because grief doesn't follow logic. The funeral was small. Private. I went. Not for closure. For clarity. My mother looked at me with something close to relief when she saw me. Victoria avoided my eyes entirely. The service was brief. The eulogies polite. Carefully edited. When it ended, people lingered in clusters, sharing memories that skipped entire chapters. I stood near the back, unnoticed. At one point, Victoria approached me. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," I replied. She hesitated. "I thought you hated us." I considered that. "I hated being controlled," I said. "That's not the same thing." She nodded slowly, like she was trying to translate a language she'd never learned. My mother hugged me before I left. No words. Just pressure, just presence. It was enough. In the weeks that followed, I expected something to unravel inside me. It didn't. If anything, things settled further. I grieved the father I never had, the family I thought existed, not the people themselves. That distinction mattered. The probate process for my father's estate moved quickly. There wasn't much left to divide. No business, no property. What remained was handled cleanly. I didn't contest anything. I didn't need to. In November, my consulting firm signed its first long-term contract. A family-owned manufacturing company looking to transition leadership without imploding. The founder asked me directly, "How do you stop resentment from poisoning everything?" I answered without hesitation. "You stop pretending it's not there," I said. "And you build systems that don't rely on silence." He nodded, like someone who'd just been given permission. That Thanksgiving, Mark and I hosted dinner for friends. Nothing formal, no speeches. At one point, someone asked about my family. I answered simply, "We're not close." No one pressed. That felt like progress. As winter approached, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. Not wealth, not status, but authorship. My life no longer felt like a reaction to someone else's script. It was mine. In December, I received a handwritten card from my mother. "I don't know how to be your mother without managing you. I'm learning." I read it twice. Then I wrote back, "We can learn separately. That's okay." I didn't expect a response. I didn't need one. By the end of the year, the story that once consumed me had become something I carried lightly, not as a wound, as a reference, a reminder of what happens when love is conditional and silence is mistaken for harmony, and of what becomes possible when you choose clarity over belonging. By the time winter settled in for real, the sharp edges of everything had softened, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer cut me. My days followed a rhythm I trusted. Mornings were quiet, work was focused. Evenings belonged to Mark and me, unplanned and unperformed. No one expected updates. No one evaluated my choices. No one waited for me to fail so they could explain why it made sense. That absence felt like freedom. The consulting firm entered its second phase almost without me noticing. Word spread. Quiet referrals. Family businesses that didn't want public implosions, but knew something was wrong beneath the surface. I recognized the pattern immediately. Favoritism disguised as tradition. Silence disguised as loyalty. Control disguised as love. During one engagement, a woman in her late 30s pulled me aside after a meeting. "They keep telling me I'm emotional," she said. "That I'm making things harder than they need to be." I looked at her steadily. "You're making them visible. That's not the same thing." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. That mattered. In January, Diane invited me to speak at a small legal conference. Not as an attorney, but as a case study. "People need to hear what it looks like from the inside," she said. I stood at a podium in a room full of professionals and told the story, without drama. No villain monologues, no moral conclusions, just facts, timelines, decisions. Afterward, a woman in the back raised her hand. "Do you regret pushing back?" she asked. I answered honestly. "I regret waiting so long to trust myself." That answer followed me home. Around that time, Victoria reached out again. An email. No subject line. I almost deleted it, unread. But curiosity won. She wrote about starting over, about realizing how much of her identity had been built on approval, about feeling exposed without it. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for anything. She ended with a single sentence. "I don't know who I am without being in charge." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied with one sentence of my own. "You'll figure it out when you stop needing to win." I didn't hear back. And that was fine. My mother and I spoke occasionally, carefully, like two people learning a new language without a dictionary. She told me about her days. I told her about mine. She no longer offered advice. I no longer offered explanations. It wasn't closeness. It was honesty. One evening, Mark asked me something unexpected. If they had done it differently, he said, would you still be there? I thought about it deeply. Yes, I said, if they'd chosen transparency over control. He nodded. So it wasn't the money. No, I replied. It was the removal of choice. That was the core of it. Always had been. In March, I made a decision that felt symbolic in a way I hadn't anticipated. I closed the account labeled Mark, not because I'd spent it, but because I no longer needed to separate that part of my life from the rest. Her gift had done its job. It had protected me long enough for me to protect myself. That spring, Mark and I talked about moving. Not to escape anything, just to choose something new. A different neighborhood. More light, fewer memories. We signed the lease quietly. No announcements. No explanations. As we packed, I found an old photo tucked into a book. My grandmother and me, sitting at our kitchen table. I was maybe 10? She was laughing at something I'd said. I realized then that she'd never once told me to be smaller. She'd just watched and waited until I was ready to stop doing it myself. That realization stayed with me. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped defining me. Because the truth is, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's not revenge at all. Sometimes it's refusing to keep participating in a system that requires your silence to survive, and choosing a life that doesn't need their permission to exist. The last chapter of this story didn't arrive with confrontation or reconciliation. It arrived quietly, the way most permanent changes do. One morning in early summer, I woke up in our new apartment with sunlight on the walls and no sense of urgency pressing on my chest. I lay there longer than usual, listening to the city wake up below us, and realized something simple. I was no longer bracing for anything. No call from my mother asking me to smooth things over. No message from Victoria hinting at a crisis. No invisible pressure to show up, explain myself, or make things easier for people who never made things easier for me. The absence of that weight was the clearest sign that something fundamental had shifted. The consulting firm stabilized into exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Small, precise, ethical. We turned down more clients than we accepted. When we did take on work, it was with people willing to hear hard truths, not just collect validation. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult meeting, My partner said, "You're very calm when people get defensive." I smiled. I've had a lot of practice. It was true. Defensiveness no longer triggered me. I could recognize it for what it was. Fear wrapped in authority. Loss pretending to be confidence. At home, life was ordinary in the best possible way. Mark cooked more. I read more. We argued about trivial things and resolved them without keeping score. Love, I was learning, didn't require silence. It required presence. In August, I received a forwarded article from a former colleague. A piece about family-owned businesses failing due to lack of governance. No names mentioned. No resemblance to my story on the surface. But the patterns were unmistakable. I didn't feel exposed. I felt understood. That same week, my mother sent me a photo. A plant on her windowsill. Something green and alive. "Trying to keep things alive now," she wrote. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Then I replied, "That's enough." We didn't talk much after that, but we didn't need to. Distance had become a form of respect. Victoria never reached out again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd taken a job in another state, something unrelated to events or consulting. I hoped it gave her space. I didn't need her to change for my story to be complete. The truth settled in gradually. This had never been about inheritance, or money, or even fairness in the way people usually mean it. It had been about autonomy, about the quiet violence of having decisions made for you in the name of love, about being told you were protected while your agency was being removed, piece by piece. Once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. And once I stopped consenting to it, the entire structure collapsed. Not because I fought, but because I withdrew. On a Sunday afternoon, sitting on our balcony with coffee growing cold in my hands, I thought back to the woman I'd been at my wedding rehearsal. Standing there with a clipboard, overhearing my fate being discussed without me. I wished I could reach back in time and tell her something. You don't need to argue. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to pay attention. Because the moment you realize that love is being used as leverage, you are no longer powerless. You are informed. And information changes everything. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Being excluded hurts. Being betrayed cuts deep. But being controlled while being told it's for your own good is the most dangerous thing of all. The way out isn't louder. It isn't crueler. It isn't revenge in the way stories usually tell it. It's choosing yourself quietly and completely. It's setting boundaries without explaining them. It's involving lawyers instead of emotions. It's letting consequences unfold without stepping in to soften them. It's understanding that some families don't lose you. They give you back to yourself. If you've listened this far, if any part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know something. You're not cold for stepping back. You're not selfish for protecting your agency. You're not cruel for refusing to be managed. You're awake, and once you are, you don't need to burn bridges. You just stop crossing them. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like or leave a comment. I read them more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories about boundaries, betrayal, and the quiet kind of payback that changes everything, subscribe. This is Eleanor Price, and this is the story of how I stopped being managed and started living.